A flight attendant tried to push a family stroller down the jet bridge, but when the father stepped in, the entire bridge shook with the power of his intervention. A flight attendant tried to shove a baby stroller down the jet bridge, thinking no one would stop him. He didn't realize the father was just steps behind, fast enough to grab his wrist before the stroller moved an inch. The moment their hands locked, the entire bridge began to shake. Subscribe. If you believe arrogance collapses the second real strength steps in. The moment Rennick Vale stepped into Kalen Dross's path, it didn't feel like a routine instruction. It felt like a disruption carefully timed to appear routine. Sir, strollers must be collapsed immediately. The voice was smooth on the surface but carried a hard edge underneath, like a dull blade pretending to be a welcome mat. Kalen looked up, one hand still on the stroller's latch. The man was wearing a Navy uniform with the Oralis insignia on his lapel and a plastic name tag that gleamed under the bridge's LED strips. Ren Vale. His smile was sharp, eyes narrowed, lips drawn into a curve that mimicked customer service but failed to mask impatience. Kalen's instinct twitched, but he responded with his usual calm. "Of course," he said quietly, nodding as he reached down to fold the stroller. He had already read every posted sign, already checked the policy for medical strollers, already confirmed the latch worked smoothly for quick transitions. He was the kind of man who planned everything 5 steps ahead, and yet he hadn't planned for this. A man intercepting him mid-bridge with a strange fixation on asserting control where it wasn't needed. Lior shifted in the stroller, half asleep, thumb curled near his cheek, a silver constellation blanket cradling his small frame. The hush of the jet bridge echoed around them, metal meeting metal, distant announcements muffled behind pressure-sealed doors, and the low groan of air currents winding through the tunnel from the terminal's ventilation system. But even with all that mechanical noise, Kalen could hear the tension laced in Rennick's posture. The man wasn't just waiting, he was hovering. Kalen bent lower, sliding a finger under the primary folding clip, but before he could disengage the latch, Rennick leaned forward, far too close, and placed his own hand near the stroller's grip. Not touching it yet, but close enough to signal ownership. Kalen froze. For a second, neither man spoke. Lior made a soft, cooing sound, blinking against the fluorescent light above. Kalen rose slowly, his eyes locking with the flight attendants. "I've got it," he said, voice still measured but firmer now. "You don't need to assist." Rennick didn't step back. If anything, he leaned in closer, and for the briefest second his expression shifted. Just a flicker, but enough to reveal something darker. Not stress, not protocol, intent. "Just making sure we keep the boarding flow smooth," Rennick replied, still smiling. But now it was a smirk, a rehearsed line. His fingers curled once around the air above the stroller, not yet making contact but clearly claiming space. The air between them thickened, laced with something invisible but sharp. Kalen's spine stiffened. In his head, Kalen reviewed the last hour. Terminal check-in, security screening, no delays, no complaints, nothing unusual except a brief glance exchanged between 2 attendants at the gate. One of them had checked his ID a little too long. Now he wondered if this moment was random or selected. The stroller was halfway folded now. Kalen had already done the work. There was no justification for interference. So why did Rennick still stand there? Another passenger entered the bridge behind them, footsteps light. The man gave a courteous nod and slowed his pace as if sensing something private. Kalen noticed it too, a shift in atmosphere. Not quite confrontation, but definitely not service. The attendant had become a wall, not a guide, and somewhere in the back of Kalen's mind, a quiet warning bell rang. This is not about the stroller. Still, he refused to escalate. With one hand, he reached down again to adjust the buckle that secured the lower panel of the stroller. With the other, he gently braced the side. That was when Rennick moved. A quick motion, too confident to be accidental, too aggressive to be ignored. His hand slid to the stroller's front bar and gripped it. Kalen's instinct flared. "Don't," he started, but before the word finished, Rennick gave the stroller a firm tug forward. It wasn't violent, but it wasn't gentle either. The wheels jolted over a metal seam in the bridge floor. Leor startled, his arms flailing upward. A startled gasp broke from the baby's lips. Kalen stepped forward instantly, his hand slapping down on the handle to steady the jolt. His jaw clenched, but he didn't raise his voice. "Please," Kalen said through tightened breath, "do not touch my son's stroller." Rennick didn't flinch. His fingers lingered. His eyes did not blink. "It was obstructing the incline," he said smoothly. "Safety risk." Kalen looked behind him. The incline was clear. No one was obstructed. There was no crowd, just a quiet metal tunnel, a few slow passengers, and a growing silence that was beginning to feel like a pressure chamber. "You need to step aside," Kalen said, low and firm. Rennick stepped back half an inch, but his hand stayed near the handle. His smile had vanished. "I'm only following compliance guidelines, sir." But Kalen saw the truth behind the uniform. This was not about policy. It was about a man looking for control, about a man who had likely been warned by a supervisor earlier and now searched for a target who wouldn't push back. A father with a baby, perhaps, looked like an easy mark. He chose wrong. Kalen didn't need to yell. He didn't need to push. He simply pulled the stroller closer, placed himself firmly between the handle and the attendant, and locked the wheels. The click echoed. Final. They stood like that for a moment, man, stroller, and storm, trapped in the stillness before the storm hit. A tremor rippled underfoot. Maybe a cargo loader shifted below. Maybe it was just a trick of nerves. But it felt like the bridge itself had exhaled. Kalen's hand tightened around the stroller. Leor had quieted again, his small chest rising against the blanket. His father's heartbeat was steady. His thoughts were not. This isn't over. Rennick finally stepped back a full pace, but his gaze lingered. Not defeated, just calculating. He wasn't done. Kalen knew that too. The moment had only paused. Something had been set in motion, something heavier than a policy argument. And the jet bridge, humming above a distant tarmac, seemed to understand. The next seconds would begin what couldn't be undone. Kalen took a step forward, one hand on the stroller, the other keeping Leor close. Rennick's eyes followed. And as Kalen moved, unaware that the air behind him was shifting, he walked straight into the threshold of something far bigger than compliance. The small tremor running through the bridge felt like a whisper of foreshadowing about what would soon explode into chaos. But Kalen kept moving peacefully, unaware that his next step would be the last peaceful moment of the journey. Kalen had just knelt, fingers slipping under the stroller strap to adjust the clasp, when Rennick Vale lunged forward without warning. His hand clamped down on the handle like a claw. The stroller jolted violently. Kalen's heart kicked in his chest. Leor's small body twitched, his arms flinching instinctively toward his chest, eyes blinking open in startled confusion. The silence on the bridge fractured. Kalen rose halfway, one hand still bracing the side of the stroller, but his attention locked on the flight attendant now standing far too close. "What are you doing?" Kalen asked, his voice low and measured but laced with something new, controlled alarm. Rennick didn't answer immediately. His face, which moments ago had been an unreadable mask, now shifted into something else entirely, something colder than frustration, sharper than routine stress. It was the look of someone who believed he had power and intended to use it. There was a flicker of satisfaction in his eyes, as if the jolt of the stroller had somehow affirmed his authority. "Strollers blocking boarding flow," Rennick muttered through clenched teeth, avoiding Kalen's gaze as he shifted his weight forward. There was no one behind them on the bridge. No line. No delay. The excuse was as hollow as the echo in the tunnel of metal they stood in. Kalen didn't move. His eyes narrowed slightly, taking in the rigid line of Rennick's shoulders, the flecks of his knuckles whitening around the handle. Something wasn't right. The attendant's stance wasn't one of assistance. It was control, assertion, challenge. "I already followed the guidelines," Kalen said clearly. "Please don't touch my son's stroller." He thought that would be the end of it. But Rennick didn't step back. He shifted instead, angling his body, tightening his grip without warning. And then, under the false pretense of helping, he shoved. The motion was swift, deliberate, and startling. The stroller shot forward down the slight incline of the jet bridge. The wheels screeched against the thin carpet lining, rubber against ridged aluminum. Kalen lunged with reflex honed from years of calm under pressure, his hand snapping to the rear bar of the stroller just in time. The whole structure groaned. Lior's small cry pierced the steel passageway, thin but sharp, filled with fear and confusion. His tiny fingers gripped the sides of the blanket tucked around him, his legs pulling up defensively. Kalen's breath caught in his throat as he yanked the stroller back toward him. The metal underfoot vibrated with tension, amplifying the sound of friction as the stroller's wheels dragged against the sudden stop. Rennick took a half-step back, lips twitching, not in regret, but irritation. His face was flushing, but not with embarrassment or guilt. There was anger there. How dare Kalen stop him? How dare a passenger resist? Kalen placed himself fully between the stroller and Rennick now, one arm extended behind him to protect Lior, the other half raised in a silent gesture to de-escalate. He didn't want this. He hadn't come for a confrontation. But now, the objective of the journey, once a simple arrival, had changed. He had to protect his son from the man who wore the uniform of safety but moved like a threat. "I said, don't touch the stroller," Kalen repeated, voice steady but firm. A breeze swept through the corridor from the cabin's open doorway, cool and sharp, brushing against the back of Kalen's neck like a whisper. It carried a strange chill that didn't belong. The atmosphere had changed. Something invisible had shifted. Rennick didn't speak. He stood still for a second too long, as though debating his next move. His eyes darted once toward the closed terminal door behind them, checking for witnesses, perhaps. Then he looked at the stroller again. His jaw tightened. Kalen could feel the energy crackling in the narrow space between them. The jet bridge no longer felt like a waiting area. It felt like a fuse, short, metal-bound, and seconds away from lighting. The silence became unbearable. Then Rennick took a breath and smiled, a shallow, artificial curve of the lips that never reached his eyes. "Just doing my job," he said coolly, stepping back half a pace, but the tension in his shoulders didn't ease. Kalen remained still, his heartbeat slowing with effort, mind already parsing the implications of what had just happened. That shove hadn't been a misstep. It had been intentional, and worse, calculated. He bent slightly, stroking Lior's head. "You're all right," he whispered. "I've got you." Lior's cry softened to a hiccup and a small whimper, eyes wide as they looked up at his father's face. Kalen didn't realize he was still gripping the rear handle so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. The metal beneath them gave a faint groan, more structure than sound, but Kalen heard it clearly. A warning, a shiver through the bones of the bridge itself. Then a thought slid cold into his mind. If Rennick had done that once, he could try again. Kalen adjusted his stance. He wasn't boarding now. He was standing guard, and with the faintest sway in the floor beneath them, a subtle vibration hummed through the walls as though the entire jet bridge was bracing for the collision between calm and chaos. Kalen didn't yet know how far the ripples would reach, but he sensed it clearly now. This wasn't just a delay. This was the beginning of something calculated, something dangerous, yet to be seen by those who would later investigate it. For now, the only truth was what Kalen saw with his own eyes. Rennick hadn't lost his temper. He had tried to make a statement, and Lior had nearly been the cost. Kalen glanced once more at the attendant, then down at his son. The next few steps weren't just travel. They were defense, and as Kalen whispered softly to calm Lior, unaware that the next few seconds would break every illusion of normal flight protocol. Rennick's fingers clamped tighter around the stroller's handle and shoved forward with deliberate force. Kalen's reaction was immediate. His right hand shot forward and clamped down on Rennick's wrist. Not roughly, not in rage, but with the kind of firm, deliberate control that came from experience. Rennick froze for a half-second, startled by the calm precision of the contact. His shoulders tensed, breath caught halfway in his chest as though he hadn't anticipated that the man in front of him would dare touch him at all, let alone stop him cold. The jet bridge vibrated faintly beneath their shoes. Metal grumbled as tension pulsed through the narrow corridor, the structure betraying the friction building between restraint and arrogance. Rennick's eyes flicked downward to the hand now gripping his wrist. Kalen didn't blink. His expression held no fury, only the sharp, unwavering focus of a man who knew exactly what he was protecting. "Release the stroller," Kalen said quietly, voice low but resolute. Rennick didn't move. His jaw flexed, the veins in his neck drawing tight under the pressure of his own self-importance. His body shifted forward slightly, an attempt at intimidation, but it failed to land. Kalen's eyes did not waver. What Rennick didn't realize, or perhaps refused to understand, was that the stroller remained at a precarious tilt, its front wheels still angled toward the slope leading to the plane's entrance. One slip, one jerk, one moment of ego overriding caution, and the 6-month-old child inside could be sent hurtling downward. Lior whimpered, a small, distressed sound that sliced through the tension like a cracked bell. Behind them, the boarding corridor remained thinly populated, just a few passengers who had begun to notice the standstill. They watched from a distance, uncertain whether to step forward or stay out of what looked, at a glance, like an argument over luggage. But it was more than that. Far more. Rennick's lip curled ever so slightly. "You're overreacting," he hissed, trying to jerk his arm back. Kalen didn't move. His hand held firm, not in violence but in the kind of restraint that makes clear the line between reason and recklessness. The air around them thickened, the ambient hum of the ventilation system nearly drowned out by the pounding anticipation building in every inch of steel that surrounded them. Then Rennick snapped. He yanked backward with full force, hoping to pull his arm free and destabilize Kalen's grip in one motion. The result was catastrophic. The combined motion sent a shockwave through the bridge flooring, a violent jolt that ricocheted off the aluminum panels and caused the metal framework above them to groan. One of the bridge's support panels trembled audibly, and from outside, a loosely secured luggage cart, parked near the side scaffolding, clanged loudly against the terminal wall. The sudden crash startled the onlookers. A young man standing further back instinctively stepped forward, eyes wide. An older businessman muttered something under his breath, gripping his briefcase tighter. But Kalen was already in motion. The violent tug had thrown the stroller into a perilous wobble, and his left arm swept around just in time to steady it from behind. His right hand, still on Rennick's wrist, held long enough for the tremor to pass before he slowly, deliberately, let go. Rennick staggered one step back, chest heaving, not from exertion but from something more dangerous, humiliation. His eyes darted to the two witnesses down the bridge, then back to Kalen, as if calculating what story he could still shape from the fragments of the moment. The air hung in a strange silence. Kalen bent down instinctively, checking Lior, adjusting the stroller's frame so that it locked fully into place. Lior's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but the baby didn't cry. He simply stared up at his father, trusting without words. Kalen exhaled slowly, brushing a thumb over his son's cheek. When he stood again, he found Rennick watching him, not with authority, but with uncertainty. Their eyes locked for a second time. Kalen's gaze said only one thing: "You will not win this with pressure." Rennick's glare answered with something darker: "We'll see who they believe." But the weight of the moment wasn't just in their standoff. It was in the bridge itself, the structure that had amplified the conflict, groaning beneath their struggle. alerting the world with a sound louder than any voice. Kalen stepped once toward the stroller, placing himself fully between it and the crew member, body angled like a shield. He didn't speak again. He didn't need to. Rennick's fists clenched at his sides, arms trembling, not from fear, but from a loss of control. The one thing he thought he held by badge and authority had slipped. And then came the smallest motion that said everything. Kalen adjusted the stroller's handle with one hand, using the other to gently tuck the navy blanket around Lior again, sealing the infant's body in safety. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was quiet. But to anyone watching, it was unmistakably clear. The man in front of them was not here to fight. He was here to protect. A low, mechanical hum echoed as the air pressure shifted down the corridor, yet not a single person moved. The final beat of tension settled into silence, thick as concrete. And in that fragile balance the stroller wobbled again, and fate teetered dangerously, preparing the scene for a moment that would define every witness's memory of that day. The bridge's tension snapped like a wire pulled too tight when Rennick Vale lunged again for the stroller. His hand shot forward in a desperate attempt to reclaim control, but Kalen Dross was faster. With a swift motion born not of aggression, but of refined instinct, Kalen's hand closed around Rennick's wrist mid-pull, halting the motion instantly. The impact of the stop resonated through the bridge's aluminum panels, sending a sharp groan through the hollow structure. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. A gust of cold air rushed upward from the aircraft's lower ventilation port, swirling around them like a silent warning. The chill didn't move Kalen. His stance remained calm, shoulders squared, eyes locked onto Rennick with a calm that belied the storm gathering around them. Rennick recoiled slightly, trying to twist his arm free, but Kalen's grip was firm, measured, not crushing, just enough to stop the man from pulling again. Lior's cry pierced the air, rising in intensity, echoing down the metallic tunnel like an alarm that no one could ignore. The sound bounced off the steel walls, reaching the ears of boarding agent Jorn Hale, who stepped cautiously into view from the terminal door. His brows drew together in confusion as he took in the scene. A baby crying, a tense struggle frozen mid-action, and a father with his hand locked around a crew member's wrist. Rennick saw him too, and immediately shifted tactics. "He's grabbing me!" Rennick shouted, loud enough for Jorn and the few passengers now visible behind him to hear. "He's hurting me!" The words rang false, hollow, but dangerously persuasive in their timing. Kalen didn't flinch. He looked directly at Jorn, expression calm but unyielding, and said nothing. The truth didn't need shouting. It simply needed presence. Still, dramatic irony turned cruel. Jorn hadn't seen the moment Rennick shoved the stroller forward toward the bridge's incline. Neither had the two passengers now approaching slowly, their faces painted with concern but lacking clarity. From their angle, it appeared as if Kalen might have grabbed Rennick first. Kalen inhaled deeply, eyes steady, and released the man's wrist without a word. The motion was slow, deliberate, but the bridge trembled again as Rennick yanked his arm back dramatically, causing a low rattle to echo through the steel joints. It was the sound of theatrics, not truth, but it worked like an accelerant on the rising tension. Jorn stepped further into the bridge now, mouth slightly parted, glancing between both men. "What's going on here?" he asked, voice uncertain. Rennick spoke first, cutting across Kalen's silence. "He refused to collapse the stroller, then got physical with me. He was aggressive." Kalen raised a single hand, palm open, as if holding back the weight of an accusation before it crushed the air. "That's not true," he said evenly. "He pushed the stroller toward the incline. I stopped it. I stopped him." Rennick scoffed, feigning disbelief. "Why would I push a stroller? That doesn't even make sense." But Kalen didn't take the bait. He gently reached for Lior, lifting the crying infant into his arms with care. The baby's cries softened slightly in his embrace. Kalen's voice, though low, held steel beneath it. You tried to enforce something that wasn't policy, and when I didn't fold, you tried to make me look like a threat." Jorn looked between them again, now clearly conflicted. He pulled out his tablet, likely preparing to log the incident. But Kalen noticed something he had clocked the moment he entered the jet bridge. The small red light above the door frame, blinking steadily. A camera, recording everything. "You should check the footage," Kalen said, motioning toward the overhead lens. "That will show what really happened." Rennick's face tightened for a split second, too fast for most to notice, but Kalen saw it. It wasn't fear of the camera. It was fear of the truth that camera had captured. And then, as if summoned by the moment, a voice crackled faintly through Jorn's earpiece. Kalen couldn't hear the words, but the boarding agent stiffened. Something had already been triggered. Protocol was moving faster than any of them expected. But none of them, Kalen included, yet knew the deeper layer underneath. Unbeknownst to everyone in that tunnel of tension, Rennick's supervisor had flagged Kalen's name earlier in the day, a mistaken identity match in the system's outdated compliance alert queue. A red tag had been quietly placed on Kalen's boarding file, subject to secondary evaluation. No one had corrected it, and that small clerical error now hovered like a ghost above the scene, waiting to turn an ordinary confrontation into something more official, more dangerous. Kalen didn't know that yet. He only knew the stroller was no longer safe unattended. He tightened his hold on Lior, eyes scanning the faces around him, Joran, two hesitant passengers, and Rennick, still playing the victim. "You will not push my son's stroller again," Kalen said, voice low but absolute. The sentence hung in the air like a verdict, and the steel walls of the bridge seemed to hold on to it, absorbing every syllable like the opening crack of a confrontation the jet bridge itself seemed unable to withstand. Kalen slowly released Rennick's wrist. The gesture was deliberate, measured, not weak. His fingers uncurled with restraint, signaling peace even as his eyes stayed firm, watching every flicker of tension still lingering in the flight attendant's posture. But the release did not ease the tension. It only shifted it. Rennick staggered back half a step, his jaw tightening. He didn't nurse his wrist or show pain. He didn't need to. Instead, he raised his voice just enough to pierce the ambient noise of the jet bridge. "This man grabbed me. I want him removed," he declared, tone sharp, performative. His words echoed against the hollow aluminum walls like an accusation fired into a courtroom. Kalen blinked once, slow and calm, holding Lior close now in his arms. The infant whimpered, the tension in the space still coiled like a live wire between the adults. Rennick ignored the baby's discomfort. He wasn't concerned about what had prompted the confrontation. He was already trying to rewrite the story. Jorn Hale, the boarding agent, stepped through the entrance flap from the terminal, his polished shoes clicking softly on the metal. He scanned the scene, crying, child, unsettled passenger, and a crew member flushed with fury. "What's going on?" he asked, cautious. "He grabbed me," Rennick said again, louder this time, pointing at Kalen. He refused to collapse the stroller, then got aggressive. Jorn's brows furrowed as he glanced between the men, clearly unsure whom to believe. But before he could respond, Kalen raised one hand and gestured calmly toward the ceiling. "Check the footage." All three looked up simultaneously. Just above the emergency lighting panel, the overhead bridge camera blinked faintly with a steady red glow. Rennick flinched. It was nearly imperceptible, a tightening around the eyes, a stiffening of the shoulders. But Kalen saw it, and that was all he needed to know. Rennick had not expected a witness that didn't blink. "He became aggressive after I asked him to collapse the stroller," Rennick added quickly, his voice rushing to outrun the implications. Kalen exhaled softly. The stroller, now resting harmlessly near the bridge wall, was no longer the focal point. The truth was, Kalen adjusted his hold on Lior, bouncing him gently in his arms. The infant's cries began to soften, pacified by his father's rhythm. Kalen's voice, however, remained steady, clear. I complied with every instruction. He touched the stroller without permission and tried to push it forward, toward the incline. Joran blinked. His face didn't confirm belief or doubt. It stayed somewhere in between, in that dangerous middle ground where bureaucracy often stalls when it's most needed. Rennick folded his arms, defensive. There's protocol for boarding flow. He was in the way. There was no one behind us, Kalen replied, unbothered. No flow to disrupt. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Kalen shifted his weight, still gently holding Lior, and with his free hand unzipped the side pocket of his carry-on. From within, he retrieved a sleek blue tablet, thin, fingerprint-scanned business-class issue, the kind only people in his line of work carried, where security and clarity were essential. He tapped the side, unlocked it with a thumbprint, and activated the recording function. The screen glowed faintly. Kalen brought it to chest height, angled slightly down, and began speaking, softly but audibly. Recording. Passenger Dross, Kalen, Aralis Flight 711, incident on jet bridge. Attempted unauthorized physical contact with stroller by crew member Rennick Vale. Escalated by false accusation of aggression. Rennick scoffed. What is this? For your followers? Kalen looked up, gaze unblinking. For legal record. Joran shifted uncomfortably at the word legal. Rennick, meanwhile, seemed to double down, stepping closer, trying to reassert control over the narrative. You're escalating this, he hissed. No, Kalen replied evenly. I'm documenting it. He held the tablet steady. Behind them, a faint noise could be heard, shoes on linoleum, the distant beep of a terminal scanner, the murmurs of other passengers now trickling toward the gate. They hadn't reached the bridge yet, but the time window was closing. Joran pressed his intercom badge discreetly. Kalen noticed the movement. It was a silent call to the tarmac station. Within moments, security would arrive. Rennick must have pressed his own minutes earlier. The setup was complete. Kalen stepped slightly to the side, placing Lior's carrier back beside the stroller. The baby's whimper had faded into shallow breaths, his body curled warmly against his father's chest. Kalen's next move was precise. He opened a secure document note, time-stamped the footage capture, and saved a copy to a pre-encrypted cloud vault. It took less than a second. The interface had been designed for high-pressure scenarios. Kalen knew because he had helped design it. Rennick watched with something between discomfort and confusion, as if realizing too late that the man he had tried to accuse wasn't playing the game. He was rewriting the rules. Joran cleared his throat. I still need to file a report, he said cautiously. You should, Kalen replied, and I'll file mine. Then, faintly, the echo of boots, metal on metal, clanged from the far end of the bridge. Heavy, deliberate, unmistakable. Security had arrived. But Kalen didn't look up. He kept his eyes on Lior's now sleeping face, one hand gently tracing the corner of the Navy Constellation blanket. He wasn't angry. He wasn't afraid. He was resolute. The jet bridge, once a simple transition zone, had transformed into something far more complex. Allegiances were shifting. Cameras were watching. And truth no longer depended on who shouted loudest, but on who had prepared quietly. Kalen returned the tablet to his side bag and stood tall as the approaching steps grew louder. The air inside the bridge felt thick with anticipation, not heat, as if metal and memory were conspiring to remember everything that would happen next. Because this was no longer just about a flight. This was about the principle of protection. And Kalen had already chosen his side. The bridge had become not just a passageway to the plane, but a courtroom of metal and echo. The heavy clang of boots against metal echoed sharply down the narrow length of the jet bridge. Officer Drenner Vask appeared like a hammer descending, broad frame, squared jaw, dark uniform cutting through the tunnel's filtered light. He didn't walk with curiosity. He walked with the annoyance of a man pulled from routine. Without hesitation, Rennick Vale darted toward him, eyes wide with orchestrated urgency. His voice spilled out rehearsed and loud. Passenger became aggressive, tried to grab me. Vask's brows furrowed, but he said nothing. His gaze shifted immediately to Kalen Dross, who stood several feet away, calmly holding his infant son against his chest. There was no struggle, no threat, just a man rooted in quiet vigilance. Kalen's eyes met the officer's without flinching. There was no apology in them, nor arrogance, only calm, earned through storms far greater than this one. Without waiting for invitation, Kalen extended the slim tablet in his hand. The screen glowed with a paused frame, time-stamped, clear, undeniable. "This is the footage," Kalen said evenly, his voice smooth but edged with precision. "It shows what happened." Vask blinked. His hands hovered over the device like a judge considering evidence before trial. "There's video?" he asked, turning toward Rennick. The flight attendant stiffened. "Recordings aren't always accurate," he mumbled, eyes darting to the corner of the ceiling where a small red light still blinked. The jet bridge's overhead cam, rolling silently the entire time. Jorn Hale, the boarding agent, stood nearby. The contradiction hadn't escaped him. His jaw shifted subtly, unease blooming behind his eyes. But Vask wasn't done. He turned back to Kalen. "Step aside. Identification, please." Kalen complied without resistance. From the side pouch of his carry-on, he handed over his government-issued ID and a neatly folded medical note. As Vask scanned it, Kalen's voice lowered, just enough for clarity. "My son, Leor, has a condition. We travel with a pediatric sensor brace installed beneath the seat cushion of the stroller. It helps monitor spinal stress during movement and incline. The stroller is medically certified." That single phrase altered the air. The shift was visible in Vask's face, professionalism overtaking assumption. He looked toward the stroller, then back at Kalen. "That's not just a stroller," he muttered, then raised his voice toward Rennick. "You touched a medical device without consent." Rennick faltered. I didn't know it was medical. There was no sign." "There's a classification tag on the handle," Kalen said, "embossed in silver. Regulation requires it." Joran cleared his throat. "It's there," he confirmed reluctantly, eyes on the floor. The tension thickened. Rennick's rehearsed story cracked under the weight of exposed truth. His gaze swung wildly toward the passengers, toward the gate, toward anyone who might still be on his side. No one moved. Then the jet bridge shuddered. Not from any human conflict this time, but from outside, a dull metallic bang followed by a deep, vibrating groan. The walls trembled as if something had struck the foundation. Startled, everyone turned toward the outer paneling. Through the narrow service window, a container lift could be seen pulling back from the bridge scaffolding below, having collided with the support rail. Dust shook loose from the riveted ceiling above. Vask steadied himself with one hand against the wall. Jorn instinctively stepped closer to the doorway. Rennick flinched. Only Kalen remained motionless, one palm still resting lightly on Leor's back. The child nestled safely against him. For a long beat, no one spoke. The shaking subsided, but the silence remained. Not from fear, but from the quiet that follows exposure. Every badge, every title, every assumption had shifted under that tremor. It wasn't just the scaffolding that had been hit. It was the illusion of authority that had fractured. Vask finally broke the stillness, voice sharp again. "We'll need a full report, starting now." Rennick opened his mouth, but Kalen spoke first, tone low but cutting. "Officer, you should know something else. This jet bridge is fitted with a dual-cam capture system, overhead and angled entry. That footage syncs to both terminal servers and mobile upload. Even if this device fails, there's a second copy." "That did it?" Rennick paled slightly, realizing there was no angle left to claim. He looked trapped, less like a crew member and more like a man cornered by his own decisions. Kaylin shifted slightly, adjusting the blanket on Lior's shoulder. The infant stirred, eyes fluttering open for a moment before settling again into sleep. Kaylin's voice softened, not out of sympathy, but conviction. "I didn't come here looking for confrontation, but I won't let anyone touch what they don't understand, especially when they don't even ask." No one replied. They didn't need to. Outside, a ground crew worker signaled to reset the container lift's alignment. Inside, Officer Vask tapped his radio, preparing to call for a supervisor. And somewhere in the distance, the sound of aircraft turbines rose, a low, constant reminder that the world kept moving, but not always forward without resistance. The bridge shook once more, faint, residual, but this time everyone noticed it differently. Because this wasn't the tremble of metal under weight. It was the warning sound of consequences arriving. And Kaylin, eyes unshaken, didn't even blink. The bridge shook, but it wasn't from a fall. It was from a reckoning beginning to rise. The container struck the scaffolding with a resonant clang, sending a judder through the steel frame of the jet bridge. The walls seemed to tense in reaction, as if bracing for more than just the impact. But inside, the real collision was already unfolding, between truth and falsehood, protocol and pride, protection and abuse of power. Officer Drenner Vask barely flinched at the external strike. His attention remained locked on Rennick Vale, the flight attendant whose shifting body language now betrayed a crumbling defense. Vask stepped closer, boots ringing against the grooved metal panels, his tone sharpening. "Walk me through it, from the beginning," he demanded. Rennick, who had held a posture of forced authority minutes before, now wavered, arms twitching as if unsure whether to cross them or keep them at his sides. His voice trembled, though he tried to mask it. "The passenger, he got aggressive. He wouldn't collapse the stroller when I asked. He grabbed me." Vask's eyes narrowed. He said nothing. Across from them, Kaylin Dross stood motionless, holding his infant son with quiet precision. Lior's breathing had slowed, but his small hand still curled tight against his father's shirt, as if sensing the atmosphere hadn't cleared. Kaylin adjusted his grip, keeping the boy secure, then with a deliberate motion, tapped the side of his tablet and pressed play. The recording filled the bridge. It began with Rennick's hand on the stroller, unauthorized, forceful, unprovoked. Then came Kaylin's calm voice, his steady wrist restraint, the attempt to de-escalate. There was no shouting, no aggression, just an escalating power play from Rennick, steadily undone by the clarity of footage. The tension in the air shifted palpably. Joran Hale, the boarding agent who had until now hovered uncertainly, exhaled through his nose. It was quiet, but it was the kind of breath that marked realization, the collapse of a lie that had nearly taken root. Officer Vask turned to Rennick. "Did you know this stroller was medical grade?" Rennick blinked rapidly. No, I didn't see," Jorn interrupted, voice softer but definitive. "It's labeled, right on the handle." The words hit harder than any accusation. Vask turned slowly to Joran, confirming the statement with a glance. Joran nodded once. Final, reluctant, but truthful. Rennick's mouth opened, then closed again. He took a half-step back. The weight of his decision, his grab, his shove, his lies, began to sink through his frame. It wasn't just about the stroller anymore. It was about the boundary he had crossed, the manipulation he attempted, and the consequences now forming around him. Then Vask's shoulder mic crackled. "Vask, this is Captain Voss. What's the delay on boarding?" Rennick turned sharply, voice low but urgent as he leaned toward Joran. "Don't tell him yet. Stall him." But he was too late. Kaylin stepped forward, his voice clear and unwavering. There was no drama, no grand gesture, just precision. "There's been an attempted unauthorized physical action on a protected infant medical device," he said, speaking directly into the mic, "followed by false statements to authorities. Passenger safe, evidence recorded." The bridge fell silent. Officer Vask didn't move. He didn't stop the transmission. He didn't glance at Rennick or Joran. He simply stood still, letting the words hang in the air and carry themselves all the way to the cockpit. The tension wrapped itself around the beams and rivets of the bridge, threading into every bolt and echo. No one spoke. No one needed to. And somewhere in that long, held silence, even the jet bridge itself seemed to understand that something had shifted. This was no longer about policy violations or procedural confusion. It was about truth, measurable, documented, undeniable. It had walked through the metal corridor wearing a father's steady voice and a baby's silent breath. The silence afterward was not emptiness. It was the entire structure holding its breath. Truth had entered the jet bridge, and it carried more weight than any badge or title could resist. No one boards until I see the footage myself. The words dropped like a gavel through the confined echo chamber of the jet bridge. Every sound stilled, the rustle of papers, the crying from a gate beyond, even Lior's soft whimpers, as if all noise recognized the gravity now anchoring the space. Captain Halrin Vosa's voice, sharp through Officer Vask's shoulder mic, carried a weight that even Rennick Vale could not shrug off. No excuses now, no protocol shield, only judgment. 5 minutes later, the captain appeared in person. Breaking regulation, he stepped out of the aircraft's sealed cockpit, an act that startled even Jorn Hale, who had never seen Voss leave the flight deck during pre-boarding in his 5 years on rotation. Voss's boots rang firm across the jet bridge floor, each step carrying the authority of a man who did not move unless necessary. He took the tablet from Kalen wordlessly, his gaze scanning the father first. Calm, composed, child in arms, then the attendant, who stood rigid with a veneer of manufactured innocence. Vos pressed play. The footage unfolded with stark clarity, Rennick's hand reaching, tugging without consent, the stroller jerking forward, Lior's startled cry, Kalen's steady restraint. Vos said nothing as it played. His silence, though, was heavier than accusation. He watched until the moment Rennick shouted about being grabbed, fabricating a narrative right as Kalen spoke calmly into his tablet. Then the captain turned. "You shoved the stroller," he said flatly, without flourish, without room for spin. His eyes met Rennick's like a sealed door slamming shut, and then tried to blame the father. The accusation hit like a slap. Rennick opened his mouth, searching for words, any words, but found none that could stand against the moving image still frozen in Voss's hand. "Captain, I thought the stroller was non-compliant and—" "Enough," Voss cut in. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It simply pressed forward with precision. "You escalated force without justification. Then you lied to security." Rennick's breath caught. Behind him, Jorn instinctively took a step back, distancing himself from the fallout. Captain Voss turned to Officer Vask. "Crew misconduct. Passengers cleared. File preliminary report and alert the cabin crew manager. Immediate review." There it was. The first time anyone in uniform had spoken the truth aloud without filtering it through bureaucracy or second-guessing. Rennick's jaw tightened. The blood drained from his face. Kalen said nothing, though the quiet steel in his eyes remained. He shifted Lior gently, adjusting the baby's blanket without so much as a gloat in his expression. His victory was not loud. It didn't need to be. Vask stepped forward, unclipping the security badge from Rennick's chest with finality. "You're on temporary suspension pending formal review," he said. Rennick's arms hung limp at his sides now, eyes darting, not in defiance but in dawning realization. There was no covering this up. Just then, a soft chime rang out, sharp and almost out of place amid the tension. Kalen looked down. His tablet screen glowed with a new notification. Upload confirmed. Jet Bridge Incident Footage Indexed. Ethics Archive. A live upload. Unbeknownst to everyone else, the footage had synced automatically to the Public Aviation Ethics Archive, a protocol Kalin had helped build himself 2 years earlier. It was designed to receive, encrypt, and index footage in real time when flagged with medical context or misconduct keywords. Rennick's repeated mentions of stroller compliance and Kalin's own spoken narrative had activated the auto-tagging system. Voss glanced at the screen over Kalin's arm. His brow lifted slightly. "Is that?" Kalin gave a subtle nod. "Uploaded to the Central Archive. Time-stamped and backed to redundancy servers." The captain didn't respond with surprise. He merely studied Kalin more intently, understanding then that the man before him hadn't just been defending his child, he had been holding the system accountable with the very tools that system had long neglected. As the realization set in, Rennick staggered slightly. Not because he had been touched, but because the last veil had been lifted. He had tried to assert control. Now, the control belonged to truth, and it was being replicated across a network of safety officers, policy boards, and aviation watchdogs. Voss returned the tablet to Kalin with care, then turned away to log the incident through his cockpit terminal. Officer Vask remained beside Rennick, escorting him off the bridge and toward the internal review office just beyond the gate. Kalin held Lior against his chest, the baby's tiny breath warm and steady again. His tablet remained at his side, but the real evidence had already spread. A moment passed. Then Lior let out a soft, sudden laugh, shrill and bubbling like sunlight through steel. Everyone paused. The most powerful sound in the corridor wasn't the captain's voice, the clash of metal, or even the uploading data. It was the innocence of a child who didn't know he had just been defended not only by a father, but by a system his father had taught to defend others. In the bridge's silence, the loudest thing was a baby's laugh, because justice had already spoken. The attendant smirked, believing he held all the control, unaware that every passenger, every camera, and every inch of that jet bridge had just witnessed a father's fury ignite. If you believe cruelty under a uniform always folds when strategy meets power, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. The moment Kalin stepped onto the aircraft, escorted by Captain Halrin Voss himself, a hush fell over the cabin. Every eye seemed to track his movement, not out of fear, but something heavier, something more reflective. He moved steadily down the narrow aisle of first class, his infant son Lior resting softly against his chest, breath warm and rhythmic. The dim, overhead lighting threw quiet shadows across his face, revealing none of the storm he had just walked through. Captain Voss remained behind him, speaking quietly into his shoulder mic. "Passenger cleared. Incident documented. Bridge secured." His voice was composed, but his gait was purposeful. He stopped only after ensuring Kalin reached seat 2A, where Kalin gently lowered himself into the leather seat and adjusted Lior's position with practiced care. He tucked a soft cloth behind the baby's neck, smoothing the folds, and gave one glance at the tablet resting in the side pocket, its screen now dark, but its evidence already doing more work than any words could. Across the aisle, a young male flight technician passed slowly, the edge of his ID badge glinting beneath his navy collar. He paused just long enough to whisper, barely audible above the hum of the air vents. "That system you built? It just saved your own son." His tone held no flattery, only stunned realization. Kalin didn't respond. He didn't need to. A single nod was enough. Behind them, the jet bridge door sealed with a quiet thud, the metal lock sliding into place. Outside, the security escort was already walking Rennick Vale down the corridor toward the internal review office. Officer Vask stayed close behind, holding the crew member's badge in one hand like a temporary verdict waiting to be stamped. Rennick's steps were slower now, head down, the posture of someone trying to outrun the weight of consequence, but the footsteps of justice were matching him, stride for stride. Back inside the cabin, the atmosphere was still and tight. A man in seat 4C lowered his newspaper, eyes sharp beneath silver brows. Another passenger shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing toward the cockpit and then back at Kalen. It was clear that word had traveled quickly, perhaps too quickly. Kalen sat upright, arms gently cradling Lior, who had fallen asleep again, mouth parted slightly, a sigh escaping now and then. His tiny fingers twitched against his father's shirt. Kalen's thoughts were quiet, but far from settled. He replayed the moment on the bridge, the sudden shove, the cry, the weight of metal beneath their feet as it groaned from human error and fragile authority. But most of all, he remembered the pause. The moment Rennick had tried to flip the story, that instinct to blame before listening. It wasn't new. It had happened to others. This time, though, the system hadn't silenced the truth. The system had caught it in real time, and that irony, blisteringly sharp, had not escaped Kalen. The same compliance infrastructure that Rennick had hoped would crush a passenger had instead turned like a mirror, exposing his misconduct for all to see. Kalen hadn't needed to raise his voice. He had only needed to raise the truth. Captain Voss returned to the cockpit with heavy steps, not out of exhaustion, but intention. Before disappearing behind the secure door, he left instructions with the co-pilot to initiate a temporary hold on departure until the command center acknowledged receipt of his preliminary report. It was an unusual delay, but no one questioned it. Jorn Hale stepped into the aircraft last, his shoes hesitant against the carpet, his posture straighter than before. His gaze swept the cabin once, then landed on Kalen. The boarding agent's face, normally neutral, now held a flicker of remorse. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Instead, he simply nodded, a small, respectful gesture that lingered longer than necessary. Kalen returned it, without bitterness. As the cabin door closed behind Joran, the sound echoed through the space like the end of a scene in a play. And indeed, something had ended. Not just a confrontation, but the illusion that silence was strength. Outside, the taxi crew reset the flight schedule manually. The passengers remained unusually quiet, some murmuring, some reflective. No one reached for a call button. No one asked about the delay. Not a single complaint was registered. Kalen sat back in his seat, glancing out the window. The tarmac lights flickered faintly against the glass, their pale glow outlining the shape of the bridge still connected behind them. He closed his eyes briefly, remembering the tremor in the floor when he had caught Rennick's wrist, how close that stroller had come to slipping beyond his reach. He reached into the seatback pouch and retrieved a small folded note from his carry-on, handwritten, carefully pressed. It was his checklist for Lior's first solo flight with him. Formula, blanket, sensor readout, emergency contact, medical tags. He glanced at it once more, then folded it slowly and slid it back into the bag. Everything on the list had been accounted for, but nothing could have accounted for what they had just faced. A soft buzz rang near the gate counter outside. Kalen could hear it faintly even through the sealed aircraft. An internal notification, likely confirming that Rennick Vale had been placed under temporary no-fly status pending tribunal review. Another chime followed. The footage had reached the compliance office of Kalen's own former advisory board. The system was now watching itself. Lior shifted again in his arms. The child didn't know the bridge had shaken. He didn't know how close he had come to becoming a statistic buried in silence. But Kalen knew. And he had done what every father must do when the ground shifts. He held the line. He looked across the aisle once more. The technician was gone. In his place, the shadows of the cabin stretched longer, deeper, drawn not just by the dimming lights but by the weight of what had passed. The jet bridge was no longer just an entry point to a flight. It had become the battleground for truth. And when the final boarding announcement played softly overhead, Kalen didn't stir. He leaned back, held Lior close, and let his thoughts drift only for a moment. Not into rage, not into revenge, but into something far quieter. Resolve. The man with the stroller had not just crossed the bridge. He had rebuilt it from the other side. The plane lifted off an hour later than scheduled, wheels retracting with a muffled clunk beneath the cabin. No applause, no chatter, just the soft drone of engines and the distant rustle of air conditioning. It should have been an ordinary flight from that moment on, but nothing about the silence inside matched the typical hum of travel. The calm was not peaceful, it was reverent. Passengers sat back in their seats with unspoken tension still lingering, like the air itself hadn't caught up with the turbulence of truth that had shaken the jet bridge minutes earlier. Kalen Dross adjusted his seatbelt and looked down at his infant son. Leor lay fast asleep across his chest, fingers curled near his father's collarbone, unaware of the confrontation he had just survived. Kalen's hand rested gently against the baby's back, his thumb moving in slow circles. His gaze swept once around the first-class cabin. Eyes met his and quickly looked away, not out of discomfort, but out of respect. There was no mistaking the weight of what had almost occurred. The passengers weren't whispering idly. They were processing. In row 4, 2 men sat hunched slightly toward one another. One, gray-haired and wearing a navy pullover, leaned in and whispered, "That baby was almost pushed off the bridge." The other only nodded. The words didn't flutter like gossip. They landed in the air like a gavel strike, final and heavy. Kalen didn't flinch. He heard it, but said nothing. Instead, he opened a leather-bound notebook from the seat pocket and began writing with slow, deliberate strokes. He wasn't filing a complaint. He wasn't outlining a legal threat. What formed under his pen was something far deeper, a structure, a philosophy. At the top of the page, he wrote the title, "Systems That Shake: The Ethics of False Authority." The irony was not lost on him. The same bridge where Rennick Vale had tried to assert dominance had now become the foundation for an ethics seminar. The same man who had claimed Kalen was a threat had exposed himself as one. And now, the same passenger who had been flagged for compliance observation was quietly drafting the framework that would soon guide the system's evolution. Up in the cockpit, Captain Halrin Voss didn't delay. With one hand on the controls, he used the other to activate the secure transmission module. His encrypted report included time-stamped footage, Kalen's official statement, and a personnel badge scan from the incident. He tagged it with a security priority level and routed it to command. There was no need for delay. The truth didn't need an announcement when it had already landed in every corner of the system. Back on the ground, in the concrete walls of the investigation chamber, Rennick Vale sat alone. The room was silent except for the soft ticking of a wall clock. His badge had been taken, his access suspended. The footage was already spreading across internal airline forums and crew discipline groups, frame by frame, replay by replay. There was no room left for narrative manipulation. His once confident voice had been swallowed by the evidence he hadn't expected to turn on him. On board, Kalen's pen paused as Leor stirred. The baby shifted slightly, one arm flopping over his father's chest. Kalen looked down, then leaned forward and kissed the crown of his son's head. The boy's breathing was slow, steady, safe. "Never be afraid to hold the line," Kalen whispered, his voice soft, more breath than sound, "if it means protecting someone smaller than you." He didn't look up when he said it. The words weren't for anyone else. Not the passengers, not the airline, not even the investigation report. That line was for a future conversation, for a day when Leor would be old enough to ask questions. About the bridge, about the moment, about why his father hadn't let go. The truth would be simple. Sometimes the legacy you leave behind starts with the moment you refuse to let something roll away. The wheels touched down at Halvin Point with a whisper of rubber and steel, but the true arrival had taken place long before landing. As the aircraft taxied slowly to Gate 17B, a silent current pulsed across secure internal networks. Footage marked with metadata from a personal device had already reached the ethics division at Valeron Aeronautics. Inside a dim glass conference room on the 14th floor of Valeron's operations hub, 3 senior analysts leaned forward toward a central screen. The title read, Authority Abuse in Transitional Zones, Flight 711, Footage Log, Verified. The case had risen through filters faster than usual, flagged not only by the contents of the video but by the credentials of its recorder, Dr. Kalen Dross, one of their own, former systems advisor, architect of predictive compliance behavior modeling. The irony did not go unnoticed. "Pause it there," said Director Mailer Venn, a gray-bearded ethicist whose calm tone often concealed fire. The frame froze mid-shove. Rennick Vale's hands caught forcefully against the medical-grade stroller, Kalen's steady wrist holding firm, Lior's small head barely visible under a constellation-patterned blanket. "That's not policy deviation," muttered Venn, eyes narrowing. "That's coercion. Intentional." They weren't the only ones watching. The footage had entered the Safety Link loop, a private ethics-sharing archive Kalen himself had helped engineer years ago. Its intelligent protocol had instantly recognized high-risk movement near a classified medical device. That alert had bounced across servers, escalated within minutes. Down in Halvin Terminal's personnel wing, Rennick Vale sat stiffly in an isolated ethics hold room, arms crossed but visibly unraveling. His badge had already been deactivated. The screen on the wall showed the initial freeze frame, one he had refused to look at since being escorted off the jet bridge. "You've been placed on immediate administrative leave," said Ethics Officer Bran Voss, reading from a prepared form. His tone was cool, not cruel. "A tribunal review is scheduled within 72 hours. "This is a misunderstanding," Rennick muttered, voice barely holding steady. "I followed protocol." He escalated. "You followed protocol," Voss repeated, raising an eyebrow as he tapped a console to display the flight footage. "By touching a protected infant device, ignoring a compliance tag, and then attempting to reverse narrative control in front of a live surveillance stream." Rennick didn't reply. His throat moved, but no sound came. Outside the ethics bay, Kalen stepped quietly from the aircraft gate with Lior nestled calmly against his chest. There were no cameras waiting, no media swarm. He had refused every request. "The story is not mine to tell," he had answered earlier through a press intermediary. "The truth is already out there." And it was. Across departments and terminals, internal memos were circulating with quiet urgency. One flagged a critical error. The system-generated compliance risk tag on Kalen's boarding profile. Meant to highlight potential non-cooperative passengers, the tag had been activated due to a software misread, an outdated behavioral prediction file mistakenly linked to his older ID credentials. The one who had approved that flag was Rennick's supervisor, a man named Jarek Lorne. By 4:30 p.m., Jarek's resignation letter sat on the desk of Director Mailer Venn. It offered no defense, only a brief line. "I did not verify the flag manually. That was my failure." Kalen didn't know all of this yet. Instead, he walked through the arrival terminal with Lior strapped gently against his shoulder, his steps calm, deliberate. The boy stirred slightly as the lights passed overhead. Back at home, the evening light bathed their neighborhood park in amber hues. Kalen walked slowly along a quiet path between sycamore trees, Lior now alert in his arms. A soft breeze moved through the leaves, carrying with it the low rustle of unseen wisdom. Kalen pointed upward, tracing the sky. "Those stars," he whispered. "They've been watching longer than any of us." Lior blinked, more interested in Kalen's breath than the sky. They stopped beside a small bench, overlooking a pond. The surface shimmered faintly, disturbed only by distant geese. Kalen sat down, held his son a little closer, and closed his eyes, not from exhaustion, but reflection. He wasn't thinking about tribunals, resignations, or flagged systems. He was thinking about how easy it had been for a lie to nearly replace the truth, and how close that stroller came to being more than a symbol. It had taken only seconds for things to turn, and only restraint to stop them. Across the street, a neighbor jogged by and nodded politely. Kalen nodded back, but didn't speak. He wasn't interested in conversation. There was nothing to explain. No one else needed to carry the weight of what nearly happened. He had carried it, and he had refused to let it drop. Later that night, as Lior drifted into sleep, Kalen stood by the window watching the moon rise slowly above the rooftops. His reflection stared back faintly in the glass, softened by the interior light. The system would change, he knew that now. The flagging protocol would be rewritten. He had already been asked to co-author it. His reforms would prevent someone else from falling into the trap of false labels and unseen assumptions. But for now, there were no signatures to sign, no statements to prepare, only silence. And in that silence he found the one thing the bridge had tried to strip from him: peace. He whispered once more to the dark sky outside, not for himself, but for the memory of what was almost lost. No applause followed, just the soft whir of the baby monitor behind him and the quiet hum of the house holding its breath. Not all victories come with applause. Some come with silence, peace, and knowing you did not let go. The screen lit up behind the speaker, casting a faint blue glow over the stage as Kalen's voice rang through the conference hall. "When systems shake," he began, his gaze calm, posture still, "the cracks don't begin with explosions. They begin with silence. A hand that pushes when no one's looking. A lie told with confidence. A device ignored because it was misunderstood." The keynote wasn't promotional. There were no slides of company logos, no name-dropping, no finger-pointing. Just quiet conviction layered in truth. The footage that had gone viral weeks ago was never shown, not once. Kalen never uttered Rennick's name. He didn't need to. Those who knew already knew. Those who didn't still understood. What nearly happened on that jet bridge wasn't an outlier. It was a pattern looking for an opening, Kalen said, stepping forward. And too often, that pattern hides behind policy, behind uniform, behind misunderstanding dressed as procedure. In the back row, a systems engineer from Therian Aviation leaned toward a colleague. "This guy doesn't speak like a victim," he whispered. "He speaks like a reformer." Kalen continued. "My son was in a stroller that day. What mattered most wasn't that someone touched the stroller. It's that they didn't stop when told. They pushed, they lied, they escalated, and no one intervened until the system was forced to listen." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Every word was weighted, deliberate, steady, like steel being hammered into shape. What exposed that behavior wasn't luck. It was structure, redundancy, verification, the same principles we apply to aircraft design, only this time applied to human integrity. Silence hung in the air after he spoke. Not dead silence, but attentive, holding, ready. Kalen raised his hand and tapped a remote. A new slide appeared, not of a person, but of a digital architecture model. After the incident, one airline reached out. They asked how to prevent something like that again. I gave them a simple answer. Don't rely on a single flag. Require two. One human can be wrong. Two must agree. Let the system challenge its own assumptions. He paused, then added, "That's now policy. It's called the Dross-Lior Protocol." The crowd murmured. Several began typing. A few heads turned toward the press section in the back. One reporter lowered his phone mid-recording and whispered, "He named it after the kid?" Kalen nodded once at the screen. "I didn't ask for the name," he said, "but I asked that if it had to bear my name, it bear his too." The screen changed again, this time, a still image of a jet bridge but stylized in lines of light and motion. No people. Just the pathway, the tension, the quiet before something snapped. He was the one in the stroller when it all happened, Kalin continued. His name deserves to stand for protection. A flight supervisor in the third row, notepad in hand, wrote the word Lior twice, once as a name, once underlined with the phrase Boundary Protocol. Kalin didn't linger for applause. He closed the presentation with one final line, letting the microphone catch the weight of it before stepping away. Never touch what you do not understand, especially when it belongs to someone you underestimated. After the keynote, Kalin stepped into the hallway as the crowd poured out behind him. Some applauded. Some simply watched him with silent respect. One young technician caught up to him near the elevator. "Dr. Dross," he said breathlessly, "my brother is disabled. He travels with a support harness. You just gave him safety." Kalin placed a hand on the technician's shoulder. Then the system worked. That night, as conference recaps hit aviation news outlets and policy forums, the term Dross-Lior Protocol surged across industry networks. Within days, 3 airlines issued public commitments to update their flagging systems. Others followed quietly, implementing discrete dual confirmation alerts for any passenger marked for compliance intervention. In training sessions from ground operations to cabin crew onboarding, instructors began telling a simplified version of the event, not about a stroller, but about integrity in transitional spaces. One trainer summarized it like this: "You're not guarding a corridor. You're guarding what passes through it. People, stories, children, don't forget that." And in the margins of printed airport manuals, in dry black ink underlined twice, a name began to appear: Lior. Not as a symbol of fragility, but as a warning, a reminder, a silent rule written across the ribs of the system itself. And Kalin, who returned home to quiet evenings and softer winds, never needed to speak of it again. He simply walked with his son under open skies, listening, watching, because the name had already done the work, and so it did. In airport manuals, security classes, and training sessions, the name Lior became synonymous with a single, unshakable principle: never touch what you do not understand, especially when it belongs to someone you underestimated. A baby's name became a boundary the entire system was forced to recognize. The mural appeared without ceremony, painted quietly at the edge of Halvin Terminal's lower concourse weeks after the tribunal's findings were finalized. There was no ribbon cutting, no press announcement. Just one morning, a long panel wall that once held generic airline advertisements now bore an image in layered grays and pale blues. An abstract steel bridge, a stroller frozen in motion, and 2 hands, one outstretched in defiance, the other locked around the stroller's handle. Not in aggression, but protection. The artist remained anonymous. No names were added. Only a small brass plaque at the bottom corner held the words, "Integrity is measured by who you protect when no one else is watching." Kalin Dross saw the mural by accident. He hadn't planned to return to Halvin Terminal, but a connecting flight rerouted him through it. He stood still for a long time, Lior asleep in the sling against his chest. He didn't need to explain the mural to anyone. And yet, a part of him wondered who had witnessed enough to honor the moment in brushstrokes. He read the plaque once, then again. His fingers brushed the edge of Lior's blanket. The baby stirred slightly but didn't wake. Somewhere in the background, an announcement played: Gate B12, final boarding. Kalin turned and walked calmly to their next gate, heart steady, feet slow. In the months that followed, Kalin quietly resumed his work. He didn't join panels or grant interviews. He ignored the emails asking for television commentary or podcasts. When an industry journal requested a full personal account, he declined with a single sentence. The footage was enough. The world had already watched. It didn't need his voice to interpret what it had seen. What mattered most was not the event itself, but what it taught, the kind of unseen moment that reshapes how systems behave when no one is looking. At home, life fell back into rhythm. Mornings were slower, filled with the sound of boiling kettles and the soft rattle of toys. Kalen designed new ethics modules in his upstairs office, sometimes with Lior sitting in a high chair beside him. The boy was too young to understand code, of course, but Kalen found a quiet joy in narrating his work aloud, describing line logic as though it were poetry. "This one says the system waits for 2 confirmations before it acts," he explained one afternoon. Lior clapped as if he understood. Kalen smiled and added, "Exactly, because one voice isn't always right, but two can hold the bridge." Even with peace restored, the memory of the jet bridge never vanished. It visited in moments, stepping into elevators, boarding platforms, narrow corridors where power could go unchecked. Kalen never flinched, but he never forgot either. Each time he walked across a walkway, a train platform, or another jet bridge, his eyes moved differently. Not nervously, deliberately. He looked for the overlooked places, for the unnoticed hands, for the tension between duty and dominance. Lior, growing quickly, began to notice his father's posture, and slowly, Kalen taught him. "You keep one hand for balance," Kalen said, kneeling beside his son at the edge of a wide pedestrian crossing. "And the other?" he asked. Lior looked down at his small palm, then reached up and took Kalen's hand. "For protection," the boy offered. Kalen's lips curved gently. "That's right." On Lior's 3rd birthday, they boarded a regional shuttle plane to visit Kalen's brother in Marlin Hollow. The flight was smooth, the crew polite, the boarding efficient. No incident, no flags. But as they crossed the jet bridge, Lior suddenly paused midway. He looked up at the slanted tunnel with its overhead beams and side railings, then turned toward his father with a curious smile. "Did we shake this one too?" he asked, the innocence of the question ringing with quiet memory. Kalen stopped, crouched beside him, and placed a steadying hand on the boy's back. "No, son," he said, voice low but filled with certainty. "We held this one steady." And that was the truth. Because sometimes the strongest thing a father can do is refuse to let go when everyone else already has. By the time the stroller was secured, the truth had spread across the entire boarding area. The father's grip forced accountability, and the attendant's arrogance crumbled under the weight of his own actions. If you believe real authority protects the innocent with precision, calm, and decisive force, subscribe now, because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores prejudice, abuse of authority, and the courage it takes to stand up for loved ones. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, accountability, and protecting the vulnerable.